or just welcome if you're new here. I'm Common Free. I'm an employment relations practitioner, and I'm also the owner and director of Free Employment Relations. I have included a list of my credentials in the description box below to give you some peace of mind around the content that I share. Relevant for today's video is that I've chaired somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 hearings. It is probably the thing that I've done most in my career. So in today's video, I'm going to share a little bit of that with you. Today's topic is the chairperson's introduction and explanation of the process. We typically refer to this as the chairperson's speech. It's that little monologue that the chairperson is going to say at the onset of the disciplinary inquiry. In this video, I'm going to share my speech with you. So if you are somebody who needs to chair a disciplinary inquiry, if you are human resource manager, a manager, or just anybody who's assigned to chairing a hearing and you would like to hear somebody else's speech, I'm going to share mine with you. You can take it down word for word, or you can adapt it, or you can, out of interest, listen to this because I'm also going to provide explanations of why I say certain things, and maybe some of that is valuable for you. If you're an employee and you're watching this, the value that I think you can derive from today's video is an understanding and maybe a little bit of what you can expect from the chairperson at the onset of the disciplinary inquiry. Of course, each chairperson might do a slightly different speech, but hearing a speech outside of a disciplinary inquiry, if you need to attend one, might help you to relax a little bit when you're going into that hearing. Now, given that I've chaired so many hearings in my career, I have had years of opportunities to refine my speech over time. What that means is every time that I did a hearing, I would be mindful of what words are commonly misunderstood, what words sometimes are lost in me trying to explain the procedure to somebody, what words are redundant, what ways of phrasing it increases or heightens the emotions in an already emotional process. And then over the years, I've adapted it to try to be as effective as possible. So what you're hearing in today's video is very much a speech that has been refined over many hearings and many years. Just two more quick things before I get into my speech and explaining it. These things are important for the video. The first one is that I'm explaining my speech and I'm sharing my speech. A different chairperson is going to use their speech and they're going to do things slightly differently. If somebody chooses to do something different to what I'm doing and different to how I choose to say something, it doesn't render it unfair in terms of the legislation necessarily. I believe that the way that I chair a hearing is to date as effective as it can be. Of course, every time I chair a hearing, I'm still very much open to refining it. But just because my goal is effectiveness and I'm going to be sharing what I think is best practice in this hearing, doesn't mean that if another chairperson is not doing this, that it is somehow wrong or not a good speech for that chairperson or the way that they conduct a hearing. So just be mindful that ineffective does not equal unfair in terms of our legislation. All right, then the final thing before I get into the speech, of course, I'm sharing my speech with you for free in this video. It would be helpful for me if you support my channel in other ways by liking, commenting, or sharing. And then for today's video, I've also created a document that is on my website for a small fee that you can download. I have loads of disciplinary documents for download on my website, but the one that I created specifically for this video is a template for managers or chair people to use when they're going to chair a hearing, and you can use it to go through the process and just fill in the necessary information as you conduct the process. It will help you to ensure that you ask all the questions that you need to ask, that you stay on track to ensure that the procedure is done fairly, that you don't miss or forget anything as you're going through the procedure. It will also give you what I believe is a good, effective structure for how to conduct the hearing. I have another one similar to this for if you're conducting performance discussions, and all of these documents are for a small fee linked on my website down below. Now let's get into today's video. So here's my speech, and I'm going to break it down sentence by sentence and explain why I say what I say. And at the end of this video, I'm just going to say it without the explanation. So if you want to jot it down, just listen to the one at the end of this video. So first up, I introduce myself. Welcome, I'm Common Free. I'm an employment relations practitioner. Some people might add here what company or organization they're from. Since my company is called Free Employment Relations, I don't include that information. I've also not found that that information is particularly valuable for someone to hear at the onset of a hearing. I find that if somebody wants to know what company I work for or what organization I come from, they will typically ask me, and then I'll disclose that information. I've also had people upfront request my credentials or my background prior to being comfortable with me chairing a hearing. I really feel that if somebody wants that information, they will ask for it, but then in the average hearing, I don't believe that it's contributed some value to everybody having that information. Then I go to a brief explanation of what my role is or what my responsibility is for the hearing. I'm here today as an impartial chairperson to ensure that the procedure is done in a fair manner. Note here, I say impartial chairperson and not independent chairperson. The reason for that is the legislative requirement is impartial, not independent. A chairperson can be somebody within the organization. It does not have to be an external chairperson chairing the hearing. So therefore that person definitely wouldn't be independent. But in any case, it's not a requirement for the chairperson to be independent. And even though I'm from a separate organization to the companies that I chair hearings for, I'm still not independent because I'm being paid for my services. So I just want to put this out there because sometimes this is also misunderstood. I'm being paid for my services. My services are that I'm an expert in the employment relationship. I'm an expert in chairing hearings in a fair manner, and I'm also an expert in making recommendations around disciplinary outcomes. I am not paid to give a specific outcome ever. If a chairperson is paid to give a specific outcome, then obviously that would render it unfair, right? Now, I don't believe simply saying that one sentence is enough here. In my experience, it helps to add a little bit more. So then I say, what that means is that I don't represent you, because I'm speaking to the employee, and I also don't represent the employer. There's often a misperception that a chairperson represents the employer. We do not represent the employer. We are there to ensure that the procedure is done in a fair manner and make a recommendation around the disciplinary outcome. Of course, I do understand that we don't live in a perfect world, so there might be chair people who are paid to give a specific outcome. However, I'm not one of those people. I spent many years studying and many years working to give my expertise to the process. I'm not going to be paid to give a specific outcome. And that's not to say that employers must agree with my recommendation. That's not it at all. There's a difference between making a recommendation at the end of a hearing and employers saying, I respect it, I hear it, I'm going to choose something else for my business, versus this is what the outcome will be at the onset of a hearing. That is something I will discuss and general ethics around the work that we do in other videos. So I'm going to move on from that point now. So that's the introduction part out of the way. Another chairperson might choose at the onset of the hearing to do introductions by all the parties. I typically do that before we've started the hearing if the parties don't know each other. Usually, in about 95% of cases, they know each other because they work in the same company, and it's usually the person's direct manager who's representing the company. However, there are some hearings that have a lot more people. Maybe a trade union official has also come, or there's a representative and we need to establish who is representing who and who is what person in the hearing. Then we do that before we start the hearing. There's nothing wrong with doing it either way. That's just my personal preference, and that's how I've done it. Then I explain the procedure. Please note that while I'm sharing my speech in today's video with you, I do make minor adaptations to the situation at hand. So I'm sharing the one that I will generally use. However, based off of the situation, I will make minor changes to it. All right, then I say, I'm going to start by asking you, I'm speaking to the employee, a few questions. These are yes or no questions related to the procedural requirements that I need to clarify. Once I've asked you those questions, I'm going to take your notice to attend the disciplinary inquiry, and I'm going to read out the charge or charges on there, and I'm going to ask you to say guilty or not guilty. Guilty meaning, yes, I did it, and not guilty meaning, no, you didn't do it. Irrespective of what you tell me, I will still provide you with an opportunity to explain to me what happened. This is an important reminder that I offer again, once we get to that point, to somebody to say, even if you say that you're guilty, even if you say that you did do it, the hearing doesn't stop there. I'm still going to collect all the information before I make a finding and I make a recommendation. So I'm still going to ask the person to explain to me what happened, even if they say they're guilty. It doesn't happen all that often, but I definitely have had several cases where somebody pleads guilty, I listen to the information, and I actually find that they're not guilty. So this is also a reminder to chair people. Please don't take just because somebody said that they're guilty, that they are guilty. Please still collect the information and make a finding. This is also one that I sometimes tailor depending on the language ability of the person. Often when I'm chairing a hearing in English, even though the person has not opted to use a translator, English may not be their first language. When I've established that this is not the person's first language, that's when I will add that previous sentence I said, which is to say guilty meaning yes, I did it, or not guilty meaning no, I didn't do it. I will also sometimes add the sentence instead of using the word irrespective of what you say to me. I will say, no matter what you say to me, I will still provide you with an opportunity to explain your side. Sometimes I find that the word irrespective is not always well understood. Right, then moving on. If you say that you are guilty, we're going to start with the employer's side. The employer can bring any witnesses, documentation, or video footage to strengthen their case. And you will be able to ask the employer or any of their witnesses any questions you have. Once the employer has completed their case, I'm going to ask you to explain to me what happened. You can also bring in any witnesses, documentation, or video footage to strengthen your case. And the employer will have the same opportunity to ask you or any of your witnesses any questions they have. This part is really just an overview of the procedure. I don't explain the opposite, so I don't go and say, if you plead guilty, then we're going to start with your version instead of starting with the employer's version. I find that unnecessarily confuses things and is slightly redundant. Because the aim here is simply to provide an overview of the procedure. I'm still going to conduct the procedure. I'm still going to lead the parties through it. And sometimes, based off of the facial expression of the person when I've just said what I've said, I remind them of that. If it looks like they might be a little bit hesitant or not clear on like, should I have followed everything she said here, I just remind them, don't worry, I will take you through it. Next, I say, once I have all the information, I'm going to make a decision of guilty or not guilty based on a balance of probabilities. This is just procedural and it brings in how the decision is made, which is a balance of probabilities. I expand on this a little bit later, right before I'm going to make my finding, and just check whether the person understands what it means to make a decision based off of a balance of probabilities. And sometimes I explain the difference, if I think it's relevant and necessary, between making a decision beyond a reasonable doubt versus making a decision based off a balance of probabilities. Then the final part that I say is, if I find that you are guilty, I would explain that procedure if we get there. The reason I say this one sentence as opposed to a whole explanation around mitigating factors and aggravating factors is because those things only become relevant if the finding is guilty. They're not relevant in all hearings because sometimes the finding is not guilty. So I'm not going to explain them at this point, given that they might not be relevant in this hearing. Also, the person is likely to forget this explanation, so I think it serves us better if I explain it right before I'm doing that part. And that's essentially my speech. So what I will then say is, I'm now going to ask you those procedural questions. Please answer yes or no clearly out loud. Then I ask those questions, then I read out the charge, then I ask them to say guilty, not guilty, and we move into the whole procedure of the hearing. How I conduct the rest of the hearing, I will cover in a separate video. To conclude today's video, I'm going to go through my speech without providing an explanation for what I'm saying if you'd like to take it down word for word. And again, as you heard now, I do sometimes adapt it and add things or say it slightly differently depending on the context. Please remember that if you are conducting a hearing, it's very important that the way that you conduct it is not to get through it as quickly as possible, not to just ramble it off as some kind of monologue, but to make sure that the person is taking in the information that you've explained to them and to try to tailor it to the situation that you have while sticking to the structure and the general how the speech goes. I've also watched other people chair hearings where they ramble that speech off as fast as possible so they can get through the hearing as fast as possible. And in my experience, this is not an effective way to chair a hearing. I understand it does get through it faster, but I believe it's important to always have respect to the person who's sitting in the hearing to make sure that they understand the procedure that you're going to follow. Right, and now I'm going to go through my speech. Welcome, I'm Common Free. I'm an employment relations practitioner. I'm here today as an impartial chairperson to ensure that the procedure is done in a fair manner. What that means is I don't represent you, and I also don't represent the employer. I'm going to start the procedure by asking you a few yes or no questions. These are just procedural questions that I need to clarify before we conduct the hearing. Once I've asked you those questions, I'm going to have a look at your notice to attend the disciplinary inquiry. I'm going to read out the charge or charges on there, and I'm going to ask you to say guilty, meaning yes, I did it, or not guilty, meaning no, I didn't do it. Irrespective of what you say to me, I will provide you with a fair opportunity to state your case. If you say that you are not guilty, we're going to start with the employer side of what happened. The employer can bring any witnesses, documentation, or video footage to strengthen their case. You will be able to ask the employer or any of their witnesses any questions you have. Once the employer has completed their case, I'm going to ask you to explain to me what happened. You can also bring in any witnesses, documentation, or video footage to strengthen your case. And the employer will have the same opportunity to ask you any questions they have. Once I have all the information, I'm going to make a decision of guilty or not guilty based on a balance of probabilities. Should I find that you are guilty, I would explain the procedure only if we get there. For now, I'm going to ask you the procedural questions. Please answer for me yes or no clearly out loud. And that is what I say at the onset of a disciplinary inquiry and why I say it. Just a reminder that I have the documents that are for sale on my website for a small fee. The payment is in dollars to facilitate automatic payments so that the document is immediately available and you don't have to wait for me to send it, but the documents are still in compliance with the South African legislation. Please consider supporting me in bringing you more of this content by liking, commenting, and subscribing to my channel and sharing this with whoever you think will derive value from today's video. Thanks for watching.